Welcome to another episode of the Seforim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Just a little note about this episode, because it's about BaOmer, and BaOmer is Matzah Shabbos this year. This podcast is being released a little early, as opposed to the regular Sunday release. There may be another episode, an extra one later this week. Stay tuned. To support the podcast or to sponsor an episode on the podcast, please email me, seforimchatter@gmail.com, or see the links and information in the show's notes below. Additionally, please subscribe to the Seforim Chatter Substack, YouTube, as well as the Seforim Chatter WhatsApp chat, where I post new Seforim books and other sorts of information. You can find links to that in the show's notes. And please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you have any guest suggestions or ideas, you can always pass them along. I have a number of ones that I'm working on, but always happy to hear about more. So you can email me, or any comments, any feedback. You can email me, seforimchatter@gmail.com, or respond to me. If you're on the WhatsApp chat, you can message me via WhatsApp. And also, now there's the first thing in the show's notes will be a comment. You can send it via text message. You can reply and you can comment on the podcast and comment that way. And enjoy the podcast episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Glatstein, who is the Rav of Kehillas Mordechai in Cedarhurst, as well as the Mechaber, the author of Machon Maggid Harakiah. There's a number of volumes, and also he has translated those and written books in English as well. And this episode of the podcast, we'll be discussing BaOmer. Rabbi Glatstein has just published a brand new book titled BaOmer, The Fire and the Soul: The Mystical Power of BaOmer, Yochai, and the HaKadosh, published through Art School. So thank you, Rabbi Glatstein, for joining me.
Hi, Rabbi Nachi. Thanks for having me.
So let's sort of tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, I'm currently a Rav in Cedarhurst, New York. I have a Kehillah, and I give Shiurim to the Bnei Kehillah, to the community. Many of them are on a number of platforms. They're online. They're audio, video, on a lot of the various platforms that are available today. I learned in Yeshiva Chafetz Chaim for many years. I have smicha from there. I have many influences, many rabbeim. And you want to hear about my yeshiva background, or
whatever you want to tell the listeners is good.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I learned in Yeshiva Chafetz Chaim. I during that time, simultaneously, I became close with a number of great rabbinic personalities, Torah personalities. First, Harav Avigdor Miller. I used to go to him for a number of years, about 3 years, the last 3 years of his life. I went to his Shiurim. I spoke with him. After that, for many years, I developed a very close association with Rav Noach Isaac Olbaum in Kew Garden Hills, who's a great Paisek and Maggid Shir, Mechaber Seforim, and also someone who's very knowledgeable in history. He, aside from all of his Haratzas HaTorah, he visited many of the ancient communities in Europe where he researches the various personalities. And then, in terms of my background, my grandfather is a Holocaust survivor. He was from Poland. He was a Talmud Muvak of Rabbi Nachum Zemba for pre-war Europe. He had smicha from Rabbi Shlomo David Kahana. He was very close with all the Gedolim and Goinim in Poland. His family comes from Ger Hasidim. His father was the secretary of the Ger Rebbe. So that's also a very important part of my background. My father is an attorney, and also lectured for a Akira V'Chaikim on throughout the country and all the college campuses across the country. He is a very eminent speaker. So this perhaps gives a little bit of a picture of my background.
Okay, so let's get into a little bit BaOmer. Let's just jump right into BaOmer. Yeah. And there's obviously more to ask about yourself and your different Seforim. Maybe at the end, if we have time, or if not, perhaps a different time, talk about your Seforim Maggid Harakiah, which you published in Hebrew, and you have the English Seforim. You also, I know you have tours and things like that in Europe. So we can leave that. We can discuss that perhaps later. So let's talk about BaOmer. I actually think this is the first episode I've done BaOmer on the podcast. I'm sure many listeners are familiar with a lot of different things about BaOmer. But being that you just wrote a whole book on BaOmer, so let's just start off with the day of Lag BaOmer, the fact that it's quasi Yom Tif essentially now for us.
Right. Okay, so I know you have a very wide gamut of guests. So let's try to approach it instead of a purely historical point of view, but let's try to approach it from a Torah-based point of view, and we'll take it that angle. You look through the pages of Shas, Lag BaOmer does not appear. You look through Chazal, Medrash, Sifra, Sifri, it does not appear anywhere in the entire corpus of the Torah Shabbat Peh, which is the beginning of the mystery. So, how could a day which has become from the most festive and joyous days on the Jewish calendar, and it has really no source in the entire gamut of the Torah Shabbat Peh? Even in the Sifrei Rishonim, you have very limited references to Lag BaOmer, because the Gemara in Yevamah says the students of Rabbi Kiva died between Pesach and Shavuos. There's no reference that they stopped dying on any particular day. The Meiri brings, there's a tradition from Gaonim that they stopped dying on Lag BaOmer. But the part of the mystery is it's not mentioned anywhere. I mean, even in the Zohar HaKadosh, it's not discussed. It's just plain and simple. It's not discussed as a festive day. Of course, most are familiar. It's attributed that it's the yahrzeit of Reb Shimon bar Yochai. So you would expect if it's his yahrzeit, it should be recorded somewhere. As we mentioned, it's not recorded in the Gemara. It's not recorded in the Kisvei Ari. Maybe there's a reference that it's called Yom HaDehilula, as his day of celebration, which is a very obscure reference. What exactly does it mean it's his celebration? And of course, you're familiar, the Chida, although in Toiv Ha'ayin, I believe he says that it's attributed to the day of his yahrzeit, but in the Mara Be'etzba, he says that there is no definitive source that Lag BaOmer is the yahrzeit of Reb Shimon bar Yochai. And there's a lot of discussion of what, in fact, was the Chida's opinion regarding whether Lag BaOmer was the yahrzeit of the Rashbi. What's interesting is, if you want to discuss what the Chida's position is on Lag BaOmer being the yahrzeit of Reb Shimon bar Yochai, but there's a very important tshuva here. There's a tshuva in the Chassam Sofer in Simon Reish Lamed Gimel Yardea, where the Chassam Sofer sort of accepts what the world says that it's the yahrzeit of Reb Shimon bar Yochai, but he goes on the offensive. He says, since when is a yahrzeit a happy occasion? If you look in Shulchan Aruch, there's a siman that records the yahrzeits of many tzaddikim, Shmuel Hanavi, Eli HaKoyen, Yoshua ben Nun, and every single yahrzeit is a day of fasting. It's interesting. There's this very important custom that we have to give a tikkun on a yahrzeit. And, they say, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said, where did this develop from? Because Shulchan Aruch says that a yahrzeit is a fast day. So, back in the day, people fasted, every Monday and Thursday, but then you read das Hadoros. So they would make a siyum, and you make a siyum, so you give a little tikkun. But then with further you read das Hadoros, so they skipped the fast, they skipped the siyum, but the schnapps is what remained. But fundamentally, a yahrzeit is a fast day. So some Sofer says, why all of a sudden the Rashbi, he was greater than Moshe Rabbeinu? Zayin Adar is a fast day, and Rosh Hashanah Yochai's yahrzeit is the most festive day of the year. And the Chassam Sofer says, plain and simple, no miracle happened on Lag BaOmer, period. He says the only thing the poskim say about Lag BaOmer is you don't fast and you don't eulogize. And the Chassam Sofer says, V'tai magufa la yadana. I have no idea. He says, I do not know why we don't fast and eulogize. So if the Chassam Sofer didn't know, then how's anybody supposed to know? Yeah. So
and we'll discuss more in the Chassam Sofer. I know you have more to say besides the halachic aspects, the machshava aspect of the Chassam Sofer you have, and this is something you discuss in the book. I want to just mention the Chida. There's a very important Chida. And the Chida, so in Shulchan Aruch, in Arachayim Tov Tzadi Gimel, Sif Beis, the Machaber, there's the Machaber, the Ramah, talking about Lag BaOmer. And the Birkei Yosef, the Chida in his Sefer Birkei Yosef on Shulchan Aruch, he says in Dalid, Sif Dalid, in whatever you call it, he says, because of Rav Magen Avram, Mishem Kisvei Arizal, the Godel Echad Omar Nachem ben Nenash, Vesigo Sefer Yadarin, the Nenash, Al Panei Simchas Rashbi. Ayin Sham, he says, V'le Kashemidi, Yom Lag BaOmer, Yom Simchas Rashbi. Chen Mash Misham Sefer Kavanas, Shasider Marash Vital, that's a Shmuel Vital, Chaim Vital's son. He says, "V'gam Kos also say the Betiras Rashbi when Rabbi Yehuda died, Yom lag LaOmer, who Yom the Hilula delay. Like you said, this is like his celebration. Im calls that with all this, Adayin Efsher the Akpei the Hayash Hayasham Al Tzion Rashbi, the Tzion Rashbi Varaya. He continues on. Now, we said from the Chida, so in Meir Be'etzpa, which is the Chida, that's like his, for like Seder, like what you should do every day throughout the year, and Siman Ches, Reish Chaf Gimel, he says, Yoim Lag LaOmer, Yarba Simcha L'Chavad Rashbi Zia, Kihu Yoima Di Hilula Delay. He says, V'noida, and it's known, Sheretzanehu Sheyismechu B'Yoim, B'Yoim Zeh Ki Yedua M'Maisim Arah HaLevi Zla U'Maisim Acherem Asher Shomanu V'Yonad Mipum Rabbanon Kadishi. We know you used to celebrate this day. V'yesh Misha Noah Glasses Limud B'Leil Lag L'Omer Be'asara Luma Shivchei Rashbi Amufazorin B'Zoyar V'Jazuta V'Minig Yafa. They actually would learn Zohar Parashim B'Yochai. Now, the thing is, so this seems to Yom B'Dihulula. What does Yom B'Dihulula mean, and what's going on here exactly? Is it his yard site? Is it not his yard site? So the Chida later on, and this is one of the big sources for saying that it's what we have today. Many people know that it's his yard site. The thing is that the Chida himself says in Toiv Ayin later on, he says that I think it's in Toiv Ayin or it's Likutim at one of the last Seforim that he wrote. He's chayzer from this, and he says it's not. That's a Toiv Sefer. The Chida was known for Seforim and manuscripts. It's a mistake. It's a printing error, and it's Yom Simchas Rashbi, which goes consistent with the Hilula. It's not actually the day of his death. And there's an extensive discussion of this. The Meir Be'etzpa, there was two editions. There's an older commentary and there's a newer one printed called Amudei Hara. It was written by Rabbi Yaakov Hillel Shlita and published by Avat Shalom. And he goes on a tangent here about Meron, about his going to, which we'll get to shortly, going to Meron, and he kind of actually decries that. But in Zion, he first discusses this about, and he quote, what happened? Was Reb Shimon Bar Yochai a nifter or not on Lag BaOmer? Is it his yard site or not? And he brings the Birkei Yosef, and he brings from Maris Ha'ayin, Siman Ches, there's another sefer of the Chida. It's a Likutim at the end. It's one of the last Seforim of the Chida. He wrote many Seforim. And he says that that even though he found in Pri Eitz Chaim, for Noida she'ikra hanusach hamuskim hu girsa shara kavanas. So the shara kavanas, that's the main girsa. The Sham Isa, and there it says Shu Yom Simchas Rashbi, not Shemeis by Rashbi. He says, Ki boy b'yoyim samach Rabbi Kiva chamisha talmidim gedolim sheniskayim ba'olim b'neim nimna garashvi. He goes with that Rabbi Kiva gave the talmidim, one of them was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai on like BaOmer, and that's where it comes. So that's the Yom the Hilula, the Yom Simchas Rashbi, not the day that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died. He says, "V'makam achar maratil ze ba'orich." He quotes this extensively elsewhere, and extensively Rabbi Yaakov Hillel goes on. It continues on, and he talks about etc. And then once he's added, we can leave this. He says, "This is Rabbi Yaakov Hillel. This davar echad shereisi kama toyim." Many people make a mistake. Yeah. And he ends up going, and you can get into this, where the Arizal would go to Shimon Bar Yochai's kever and like BaOmer, and therefore people today do, and on and so forth. But that's really the background, at least for a lot of where the Shemeis by Rashbi, that it's Shimon Bar Yochai's yard site, comes from, and the Chida himself later on, in his latest form, says no, that was a mistake. It's not really Shemeis.
So in terms of the Chida, where the Chida says that the gersais of the Kisvei Ari are mostly corrupt and they cannot be relied upon. So there are different ways of understanding Chida. Those who wish to, so to speak, accept the prevalent custom of going to Meron, they say the Chida didn't mean that it's not his yard site. He's just saying that those words of the Ari independently are not conclusive that it is, but not that the Chida himself didn't believe that it is. That's how there's a kuntras that came out on Lag BaOmer, and that's how that particular author presented the opinion of the Chida. It is important to note, even though there is a question regarding the veracity of whether this is a source or not, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz and Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen both write definitively that it is in fact the yard site of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So certainly it's something that's niskabel in Klal Yisrael, although on a closer examination, it's hard to pinpoint what the source is.
Oh, yeah. So perfect. So, and I think you mentioned the Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Kiva's Talmidim, and then we get into Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Yeah, so
Chida himself, offers a possibility. Well, even if it's not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's yard site, but we know that after the students of Rabbi Kiva all passed away, because here's a foundational point in Lag BaOmer, and that I discussed in the book, is the question of the Pri Chadash, and the Chassam Sofer also deals with it. And that is, it seems pretty odd that we're celebrating that the 24,000 students of Rebbe Akiva stopped dying. That would be reasonable if, let's say, there were like 15,000 left, or even 1,000 left. But if the reason they stopped dying is because they're all dead, that doesn't sound like a very reasonable reason to celebrate. Yeah, the reason they stopped dying is because they're all gone. So Pri Chadash questions, it can't be because the students of Rebbe Akiva stopped dying. So the Chida himself, as you mentioned, suggests, well, maybe it's the day that Rebbe Akiva went to Rabbi Seinu Shabadarim and he began to restart the tradition. There's an amazing point mentioned by the Ramami Pano in Mayan Ganim. I believe it's in Chelek Gimel, and I'm not sure why this is not so well known. The Mayan Ganim says that there were survivors from Rebbe Akiva's students. You know who they were? There was actually one. Who? Rebbe Akiva. Because the decree was on him as well. And he survived. And that was a pretty eminent She'iras HaPleita. In other words, the celebration is that the Gezerah was Nisbatel. For who? For Rebbe Akiva himself. So that's an interesting possibility. So then it would come out, it's not really the day of the Simcha of the Rashbi, it would be the day of the Simcha of Rebbe Akiva himself. You know, that's the approach of the Ramami Pano.
But be that as it may, today it really is the Simcha of the Rashbi. I think in Meron, although this year I think because of the situation as well, they're not having anyone really there. But everyone, you know, in general, in recent years, and obviously there was the tragedy a number of years ago in Meron, but in general, Meron has been where, you know, everyone really goes to. And as I mentioned, Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, anyone wants to read it, you can read inside what he, you know, kind of, even though he kind of tries to play it both ways, he cries it and he rails against it. But even though he says, of course, he's not saying that you shouldn't, etc. So you can see it there inside in his Sefer. But let's talk about Gedolim that went to Shimon. I started mentioning, he mentioned there is this thing that the Arizal go, did not go, and like BaOmer, and there were Gedolim that went, and we can get into bonfires, etc.
Historically, you know, I don't think Rabbi Kiva Eger didn't go to Meron, and the Marsha didn't go, and like I was, you know, I don't think, you know, the Gedolei Rosh Yeshivas in Europe didn't go, but we have a record from Rav Shmuel Heller that the tradition is the Or Chaim HaKadosh went to Meron in great Yiras HaKavod. I mean, the description of the Or Chaim HaKadosh, when he got to the foot of the mountain, he got down on all four and he literally crawled up the mountain. That's the report of the tradition that Rav Shmuel Heller reports.
And Rav Shmuel Heller was Rav in Tzfas in the 19th century.
Right, Rav Shmuel Heller was the Rav of the Prushim of the. So you had the Bas Ayin was together with Rav Shmuel Heller. Actually, Rav Shmuel Heller was very knowledgeable in other disciplines as well. He actually studied medicine, and when he met the Bas Ayin, Rav Shmuel Heller said, you know, he feels that his learning of Chachmas Refuah is clouding, is befuddling his kedusha. You know, he thinks he has to stop practicing medicine. Legend has it the Bas Ayin put his hands on Rav Shmuel Heller's head and he cured him from any adverse effects. Anyway, Rav Shmuel Heller was records Or Chaim HaKadosh went to Meron. The Ben Ish Chai made an amazing pilgrimage. He made the trek to Meron. I mean, that's fraught with great danger. And he even composed the piyut, V'amartem Kol L'chai, a very Kabbalistic piyut, which David HaMelech said the words V'amartem Kol L'chai, and the Ben Ish Chai. Actually, you know, the Ben Ish Chai wrote an entire sefer for Lag BaOmer. It's called Hilula Rabbah. You know, basically a collection of different Ma'amorim and Shivchei Rashbi. So for, you know, to think about how much time it took the Ben Ish Chai to make that trek and to get to Meron, you know, it's pretty remarkable that someone of his caliber made that trip. And then I mentioned my background, but you know, if I can mention a little bit more just in this context, my grandmother, my father's mother's father, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Leib Volman, was the last Rav of the city of Sakhachev. He was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was a Talmud of the Eretz Tzvi, the Kuzhaglover Goin. And I believe in 1929, the Eretz Tzvi went up to Meron, and he even records in a Shalas Tshuvas a chidush that occurred to him at Meron in 1929. If I could share, it's actually very interesting. He says that in the bracha to Naphtali, it says, Naphtali ayala shlucha hanoisen imrei shafar. So the Targum over there says, hanoisen imrei shafar, that Naphtali has a very bountiful and fruitful land, and Naphtali will praise and be mavarech Hashem for his fruits. So the Eretz Tzvi, at Meron, he was bothered. What do you mean he's going to make a bracha? The pasuk is saying he's going to make a bracha? Brachas are d'Rabbanan. How could the Targum interpret the pasuk that Naphtali is going to make a bracha? Brachas are only rabbinic in nature. So the Eretz Tzvi says, actually, there is one opinion that brachas are d'Oraisa. Who's that? Rav Shimon Yochai in the Zohar, Paskin's brachas are d'Oraisa. And Naphtali's Meron is in the chelik of Naphtali. So when the Targum says that Naphtali is going to make a bracha on fruits, it's Reb Shimon l'shitase, because Meron is in the chelik of Naphtali, and in the chelik of Naphtali, brachas are in fact d'Oraisa. So that was a chidush that Eretz Tzvi records. I mean, here you're talking about he's Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin after Meir Shapiro, and he made the trip to Meron, in the early 20th century, and he's recording chidushei Torah that occurred to him. There. Yeah. So that's another personality who visited Meron. And, if you've ever seen, there's a sefer on Lag BaOmer, a wondrous sefer. It's called Kedai Reb Shimon. It's written by Reb Pinchas Friedman, Shvilei Pinchas. He has an entire sefer. And there also he brings Kedushim that occurred to him standing between the kever of the Rashbi and Rabbi Lazar.
And yeah, we'll get more to your sefer. Obviously, your sefer is a lot. You have a lot of machshava, as you already alluded to some of it here, and we're going to talk some more about it. I just want to mention historically, there's one other thing that I want to clarify this misconception about the Bartanura. The Ravaji Bartanura, who I hope to do a podcast episode one day about these letters, fascinating letters he traveled from, where he was in Italy. He went to Eretz Yisrael. This is in the 15th century, so before the whole Tzfas and Rebbe the generation before that. And he goes to Eretz Yisrael, and so he relays on the way, and in Eretz Yisrael, it's very, very fascinating historically to read. But one of the things in his second letter, he's sending these letters back to Italy to his father, he says, Kivrei Shaladenenu Shmuel Haramasi. He says the Kivrei of Shmuel, and I'm saying this because it's quoted by a lot as it's somehow it got attributed to Rabbi Yehuda, but he says this about Shmuel, and he says the Kivrei of Shmuel, it's in the Jewish hands. So coming up, that many people go on Chavches Iyar. In the day that Shmuel Hanavi died. They like greatly the torches or bonfires. This gets into the bonfire thing and like where which we can get into. Not only in Ner Tamid, even the Arabs are worried. Many things over there. This is very. That's a side point. He's very busy complaining about what was going on in Yerushalayim at the time. Anyways, he continues. He says, however, I didn't see any miracles, anything that changed. Besides for Sha'imrim, that many say Shahabi Akaris Nifkudu, many women that are barren, they now have children, many sick people got healed, they made a promise at the place. They daven there. And he ends off, there's no proof to any of this. So Bartanura was Italian. It sounds like a Litvak, but it was Italian.
It's interesting that and it's not like the Bartanura didn't believe in any miracles, because in other letters, he writes that he was in Haifa and he was in the cave of Eliyahu Navi. He writes wondrous, miraculous things that he witnessed there. So it's not like, he was skeptical of anything. So if he's telling you nothing happened there, nothing happened there.
He's just saying he didn't see anything, and there's no hechra. Now, the thing about it is, so that letter, obviously a very important historical letter to give us a glimpse of what was going on at the time period in Eretz Yisrael. The thing is, it's attributed that this story happened with Rashbi, but the edition that I'm reading is the critical edition published, Me'Itali Yerushalayim, Igroisa Shel Baravaji Bartanura Me'Eretz Yisrael, edited by Menachem Emanuel Hartam and Avram David. This is done for many manuscripts of these letters. There are other editions, and some of them they suggest a change to say it's Yud Ches Iyar and it's supposed to be Rashbi, but it doesn't seem like that's not what the manuscripts say. It doesn't seem like what he's referring to at all.
Yeah.
So there are some sources that say that. But let me ask you, is there more to talk about, like with regarding bonfires now, especially in Meron and Stam, like BaOmer, there's a big bonfire inyan.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think what's most striking is the development of this custom that, until last year, there were 500,000 Jews going to Meron, which is if probably the most well-attended Jewish practice today on our calendar. I don't think you could think of any occasion in Jewish observance that attracts more attendees. So the question is, how do we explain this phenomenon? Why has this phenomenon, drawn so much attention in recent years, more than any other phenomenon? I know, there's a big Birchas Kayanim, but you don't have 500,000. I don't think you have 500,000 Jews attending that. So that's basically one of the main premises of the Sefer, which is a very interesting idea, and a general phenomenon that I think you could observe in yeshivas around the world today. Even there's certain mystical ideas, metaphysical ideas, call it machshava, call it mysticism, that are more available to the regular yeshiva bachar today, that a regular talmud in yeshiva is more fluent in today than really any other time in history. I think what used to be reserved for the elite or for the select few has become, sort of nachlas ha'am today. The Seforim, back in the day, 25 years ago, the Seforim that B'nai Torah would learn, aside from, Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, Masilas Yesharim, Sichas Musar of Reb Chaim Shmulevitz. Today, for instance, the Seforim of David Kohen, Rosh Yeshiva of Hebron, is Mole V'Gadosh of Graz and Ramchals and really very high-level mystical information. And this has become sort of what 30 years ago was only a few people knew about. The call it Kabbalistic ideas are sort of much more out in the open. Familiarity with the meaning of the spheroids and so forth. And I think that's also worthy of our attention. In other words, is that somehow connected to this recent phenomenon of the attraction to Meron? This is a question also that Rabbi Yaakov Hillel wrote a sefer on Lag BaOmer called Eid Hagal. I have it behind me. Eid Hagal, which is an amazing sefer. And he's very troubled. He picks up on this, and he's very troubled. There's a famous comment of the Zohar. I think it's worthwhile to mention here and to try to understand what it means. The Zohar writes in the Raya Mehemna, in the end of Parshas Nasai, he says, "Uvegin." It's a historical prediction. The Zohar HaKadosh says, "Uvegin da asidin Yisrael lemita mehai ilani dechaye ihu sefer Zohar yipgan min galus barachame." That the day will come where the Jewish people will taste from the Zohar HaKadosh, and then they will be redeemed. In other words, the Zohar is saying that a prerequisite for the coming of the Geula is learning from the Zohar. Okay, that's the statement of the Zohar HaKadosh itself. And Rabbi Yaakov Hillel is very bothered by this. Really? The prerequisite for Mashiach coming is people learning the Zohar, but aren't there all kinds of prerequisites needed to learn the Zohar? Don't you have to be Malei V'Gadosh? Don't you have to be Malei Kreisei Shasu Poiskim? And you have to have Kedusha, you have to have Tahara. And Reb Chaim Vital himself rails against people prematurely learning the Kabbalah. The Ramak says something very important. Ramak says that unless someone is grounded in the Talmudic process of Talmudic analysis, they have no right to learn the Kabbalah. Because if you don't know how to think, you can't approach not the Gemara and not the Kabbalah. So Rabbi Yaakov Hillel sort of says, well, if in order for Mashiach to come, people need to learn Kabbalah, and in order to learn Kabbalah, you have to be Malei Kreisei Shasa Poiskim. So basically, we're going to be stuck in America for a very long time because nobody could possibly learn the Kabbalah that's necessary for Mashiach to come. So Rabbi Yaakov Hillel advances a very interesting thesis, which I have a different approach to in my Sefer, that even though most people are not going to be learning the Kabbalah today, but this is like Rabbi Yaakov Hillel L'Shitase, where Rabbi Yaakov Hillel holds that when there's a dispute between the Poskim and the Mekubalim, we're going to follow the Mekubalim. For instance, if there's a machlokes between the Mechaber and the Ari, Rabbi Yaakov Hillel says we're going to follow the Arizal. Like the Chidah said that two things. The Chidah writes that if the Mechaber would have known what the Ari said, he would have retracted. That's what the Chida says. That if the Mechaber would have known what the Ari says, the Mechaber would have retracted. And furthermore, the Chida writes, the Mechaber didn't even know 1/1,000th of what the Arizal said. So Rabbi Yaakov Hillel says, accordingly, if we're going to always follow the Arizal, so even though we don't technically learn Kabbalah, but our practice is rooted in Kabbalah, because we're always going to follow the Mekubalim, so that's how we're going to bring Mashiach. However, that's one could challenge that and say that it's well known. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, on these words of the Chida, he said that he doesn't agree with them. Rabbi Ovadia says, who says that if the Chida would, if the Mechaber would have known what the Ari says, he would have retracted? It's not true. How do you know that? How do we know that the Mechaber would have retracted? How do we know that the Mechaber would have deferred to the Ari? The Rabbi Ovadia famously holds that when you have a machlokes between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ari, we will always follow Maran Bet Yosef. And for Ashkenazim, Rabbi Moshe writes very openly that in halacha, the Arizal is no different than any of the poskim. He's not given any more credibility than any of the achronim. And Rabbi Moshe says, therefore, in halacha, the idea that we follow the mekubalim over the poskim is only applies to the Zayar and the Tikkunei Zayar. Does not apply because that's from the Tanoim that Rabbi Moshe says. But as opposed to Kisvei Ari are not given any unique status in halacha. And so therefore, it begs the question, Rabbi Yaakov Hillel tried to come up with this approach, how we're going to bring the Geula, because our practice in halacha is rooted in Kabbalah, but that's certainly not accepted by Rav Moshe, not accepted by Rabbi Ovadia. So there's an idea that even though in our time we're not fluent in the Kabbalah, but if you examine the language of the Zohar says in the end of days, people are going to taste from the Ilanei Dechai. They're going to taste from the Zohar. That would usher in the Geula. But that shows us something very important, that Reb Shimon and his teachings are, so to speak, the key to unlock and bring us to the finish line. And if we see a Jewish practice of this magnitude, where Jews they don't even know why they're going, even Jews who are going to barbecue, you could barbecue anywhere, there are a lot of tzaddikim in Eretz Yisrael that you could be drawn to. There are tzaddikim everywhere. The fact that there is such a Jewish practice today means that it's rooted in something meaningful. And it seems that is because of this teaching of the Zohar, that connecting to Reb Shimon and the teachings of Reb Shimon, as the Zohar in fact writes, is going to usher in the Geula. So this phenomenon of that we see of in recent times is very uplifting, because it means that the souls of the Jewish people recognize this is the place from which we're going to get what we need to bring in the redemption. It's interesting. Also, I speak about it in the introduction, the concept that in terms of what license we have to learn some of the more esoteric sections of the Torah, it's not a black and white brick wall. In other words, it's not can you or can't you. It very much is relative to the times you live in. And this is really a phenomenal idea. We bring from Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver, and also the Baal HaLeshem, Rav Shlomo Elyashiv, Rav Shlomo Elyashiv writes explicitly something very amazing. He says, what was forbidden yesterday is permitted today. Which means that the license we have to learn certain portions of the Torah is depending on the generation that we live in. Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver writes that when the Beis HaMikdash stood, so we have Mishnayos and Chagiga. It said, we don't teach Ma'aser Merkava, we don't teach certain things except for people who reach a certain level of Chachma and a certain level of Kedusha. However, he says that was back in the day when people saw miracles in the Beis HaMikdash. People, even in the academies of Suram Pampadisa, there were miraculous feats. The Chazal say that fire came down in Hashamayim. So their emunah was fortified by the times they lived in and what they were able to experience, as opposed to in our times that we're really living in the darkness of Galus. Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chaver says, if not for some exposure to the esoteric portions of Torah, then Klal Yisrael would not have had any continuity. And there are many sources to this idea that the allowance and the license to certain sections of Torah, it is very likely that what was not available 50 years ago is not only available today, but is permissible today. Everybody should consult with their own personal Moira Derech in terms of what is permitted to be accessible and so forth. But there's a sort of a sliding scale. It's not a absolute restrictive type of discipline. And if the fact that today people are thronging to Reb Shimon and that these branches of information are much more available and accessible, so that's, so to speak, it's reflective that the time is ripe.
Now let's go back to a little bit to the Chassam Sofer. This is something you discuss at length in the book, and you mentioned this, you alluded to this earlier, where you said the tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, I think it's the base of Ephraim, right? The tshuva where he talks about like BaOmer and what reason can you find for it, but the Chassam Sofer, despite that tshuva, he has a number of reasons he discusses, or Shimon at length, or Shimon Yochai and Zohar, and like BaOmer.
Yeah, so this is a very important dichotomy that you're picking up on. So here, there's nobody who spoke out against Lag BaOmer more than the Chassam Sofer, right? Could you think of any Achron that challenged, that more than challenged? The Chassam Sofer says, count me out of it. Everybody's going up to... Chassam Sofer blamed the earthquake of 1837 and the destruction of Tzfas on the phenomenon of Jews flocking to Kvarim in Tzfas and Meron. So he said that the phenomenon of going to these places is responsible for disaster. And yet, there is no one who wrote more about Lag BaOmer than the Chassam Sofer himself. I mean, like off the bat, I could tell you, 5 different reasons the Chassam Sofer writes, throughout his drashos, in Torah's Moshe, in Chassam Sofer ala Torah, off the bat, Chassam Sofer created, this is amazing. Chassam Sofer says, Lag BaOmer is the celebration of the day. That's when the mun first fell for the Jewish people. Chassam Sofer writes, and by the way, Chassam Sofer says, I know it's against the Gemara. The Gemara says the mun began to fall the day after Pesach Sheni. If I may, I'm very into Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, there's also a legend, talk about days that are inconclusive or unverifiable that there's a yard site. But Pesach Sheni is the last day the matzah that Klal Yisrael took out of Mitzrayim lasted. And then the next day, presumably, the mun fell. If you learn the Gemara in Shabbos says the mun fell, Tes Vav Iyar. Chassam Sofer writes in 4 places that no, it fell on Yud Ches Iyar, Lag BaOmer. Based on what? Based on a medrash. And nobody has ever found the medrash that the Chassam Sofer quotes that the mun began to fall 3 days later. But the fact that the Chassam Sofer reiterates it 4 times indicates that he held it was a thought of a notable standing. Okay, so that's one approach Chassam Sofer gives. It's the day the mun fell for the Jewish people. In Parshas Tazriah, Chassam Sofer says another amazing thing happened on Lag BaOmer. Chassam Sofer says that the Jewish people left Mitzrayim. They had their bris milah on Pesach. The Zohar teaches that the neshama comes down at the time of the bris, but it's not fully settled until 33 days later. So Chassam Sofer says it comes out that on Lag BaOmer, that's the day the soul of the Jewish people was fully acclimated and settled in their system. So therefore, that's also makes it a day of significance. It's the day the collective soul of the Jewish people was miyushav, it was settled in their systems. The Chassam Sofer also writes that Lag BaOmer is fundamentally connected to revelation of the secrets of the Torah. Chassam Sofer writes many places on the pasuk, Gal Einai Va'abita Neflois M'Tarasecha. Gal is 33, that on Lag BaOmer, it's a day that secrets of the Torah are revealed to the world. And if you accept that Lag BaOmer is the Yom HaPtira of the Rashbi, we know that the Idra Zuta was either written in completion or at least finalized on Lag BaOmer. It's interesting. The number 33, the Chassam Sofer says, is always affiliated with Kedusha. For example, the Sefer Yetzirah says there are 32 byways of Chachma. and following the 32 Ba'is of Chachma begin the secrets of the Torah. That's probably the most well-known source that people quote about Lag BaOmer is the Bnei Yissaschar, where you have 32 days, connected the 32 pathways of wisdom, and then on the 33rd day, Leiv Tov, the Bnei Yissaschar says. Leiv is 32, and Tov are the final 17 days. The 33rd word in the Chumash is Vayar Likim Ki Tov. That reflects the secrets of the Torah. So Lag BaOmer is, Chassam Sofer writes, is affiliated, is connected, associated with the secrets of the Torah. There's another idea Chassam Sofer throws out, which is also very interesting. He writes in the Drashos that, Pirkei Avos tells us there are 4 crowns. You have Keser Torah, Keser Kahuna, Keser Malchus, and then Keser Shem Tov Oila Al Gabeyan. So Chassam Sofer says, so if we break Sfira into 3 parts of 16, the first 16 days are Keser Torah. Do we have Torah today? Yes and no, the Chassam Sofer says. Yeah, we have a lot of books. You wouldn't have a podcast if there was no Torah, if there weren't books. So we definitely have a lot of books. There's a lot of Torah, but the Gemara in Chagiga says we used to have 600 Sidrei Mishnah. Now we're left with 6. There's an idea the Gemara writes about in many places, Malka Visareha Bagoyim Ein Torah, that basically we pretty much lost the Torah. There's an idea that we lost a lot of Torah with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So the first 16 days reflect Torah. The state of Torah is, it's like half-half. We have some of it, we lost part of it. That's why the first 16 days, some Jews observe Avelos, some Jews don't observe Avelos. The next 16 days, the Chassam Sofer says, are Keneged Keser Kahuna. Keser Kahuna is Avoida. That we don't have at all. And that's why all Jews observe the second 16 days of Sfira from Rosh Chodesh Hanan. And then the final 16 days is Gemilas Chasadim, which the Chassam Sofer says is the only thing that we have left in its full glory. And Lag BaOmer starts the last 16 days of Gemilas Chasadim that Klal Yisrael never lost any of it. And the Chassam Sofer brings proofs to this idea. The Gemara also, in many places, writes that basically, Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim, we have no Avodah. Torah, we basically have nothing left. And Gemilas Chasadim is the only thing we have left. So Lag BaOmer sort of is the kickoff of the Yemei Gemilas Chasadim. But it creates an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, nobody challenges and says, leave me out of Lag BaOmer more than the Chassam Sofer. And on the other hand, nobody gives more Torah for Lag BaOmer than the Chassam Sofer.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point and something that you discuss at length in the book, in the Sefer. So there's that. You mentioned Rabbi Glatstein. You have a whole book on him, and that's the Pesach Sheni. We'll leave that for a future episode. Perhaps we'll come back to that. I will mention already, I should mention here that the new book and the other one, you have them in English, Art Scroll. You also have Machon Maggid Harakiah. So but definitely the Rabbi Glatstein and like BaOmer book specifically, I'll put a link in the show's notes where anyone interested can purchase it. It's available at artscroll.com, various Seforim stores. It's available in stores, online. So I just want to make that mention that point. Now, something else I want to point out about Lag BaOmer here is that there's another yahrzeit, one very famous yahrzeit in Lag BaOmer that you mentioned earlier, that the Rosh Yeshiva, the different dignitaries in Europe would not go to Meron, and part of that it was hard to travel. You couldn't just get on a plane, but they did go on Lag BaOmer to the kever of the Ramah. The Ramah Moshe Isserlis is his yahrzeit in Krakow, right? Is on Lag BaOmer.
Yeah,
and they would go to him. So talk a little bit about the Ramah and his yahrzeit being on Lag BaOmer, and I believe there are those that still go today.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to be going there. I'm leading a trip to Krakow. We're leaving Wednesday night, but for Lag BaOmer. It's an interesting thing that historically in Lag BaOmer, part of the duties of being a rabbi in Krakow is you would have to give a drush on the Ramah's yahrzeit and the Ramah's shul. So you had many distinguished rabbanim in Krakow. The Shach himself was a Talmud of the Meginei Shloimeh. Shach came to Krakow to learn from the Meginei Shloimeh. The Bach was in Krakow, and Tosfos Yom Tov was in Krakow. And you have Megala Amukais, of course, was in Krakow. You have Reb Shimon Sofer gave a very famous drashos on the Ramah's yahrzeit. Yeah, Reb Nechemia Kornitzer was a Rav in Krakow, and Rabbi Yosef Engel in the Seforim of Rabbi Yosef Engel. He has astounding drashos that he gave on the Ramah's yahrzeit. One very interesting point that Reb Shimon Sofer once made on the Ramah's yahrzeit was that there are only 2 people in history whose father's name is seared onto their own name. Reb Shimon bar Yochai, and Reb Moshe Isserlish, right? Because Reb Moshe's father was Isser. So it's interesting, this phenomenon. The two great luminaries whose fathers' names were fused onto their name are the two tzaddikim who passed away on Lag BaOmer. And his point is that neither of them innovated a discipline on their own. Everything that the Rashbi did was founded on the Torah of Rabbi Akiva and earlier Tanoim. He's basically continuing on the legacy of the earlier authorities, as well as the Rama. Rama was continuing the Messiah of Chachmei Ashkenaz, the Maharil, Mari Bruna, and so forth. So that's an interesting observation. My father suggested, and maybe this will bring us back to the dichotomy of the Chassam Sofer, and that is, even though the Rashbi's yahrzeit is on Lag BaOmer, nevertheless, when it comes to actual practice, you have to follow the Piskei Halacha of the Poskim. So you have the Rashbi and the Rama. In a way, you couldn't have two more polar opposite type of luminaries, but nevertheless, and I think this is the approach to how do we understand the Chassam Sofer, that in the realm of Kabbalah and mysticism, of course, the Chassam Sofer could supply you with countless reasons for Lag BaOmer. But when it comes to Jewish practice of how to conduct oneself, halacha l'maisa, Chassam Sofer says, I have no idea the reason for this. And not meaning none of my reasons will justify halachic practice. And I think that's a very important ideal and value for students of Torah to know that on the one hand, it's very important to be educated in many ideas, and there's so many Seforim out there, but halacha l'maisa is not going to be governed by an idea that you see in the Drashas Chassam Sofer. Because even the Chassam Sofer would never say or govern how one should behave based on what he wrote in the drashas. It's beautiful for Torah, for understanding, for Havana, for Machshavas Torah, and for Limud Torah. But it's not going to enter the realm of halacha l'maisa. Many people get confused about that, and I think studying the Chassam Sofer here is a very good way to highlight that not everything you learn. It's important to know. It's important to learn. And it will even elevate your perspective on something, but it won't govern the way you accord yourself l'maisa.
Yeah, you really see that distinction in the Chassam Sofer. Like you're saying, it's a really good example for other areas of Yiddishkeit. So one other yahrzeit I want to mention on Lag BaOmer is one that you brought up to me. It's worth mentioning is the Ramesh Narol is buried in Metz in France, and it's worth mentioning. We're talking about Lag BaOmer here and the yahrzeit of Gedolim. As you told me, you sent me a picture from his kever. He's the author of Kel Maleh, but he's known. The Chida talks about, first of all, he's famous. His son was the Tuvia Haroife Maisa Tuvia, very famous, important work. But he was someone I believe escaped around Takvatat. He dies in Metz, but the Chida says he was a friend of Rabbi Heschel of Krakow, and maybe he learned by his father. And so that's his yahrzeit is also, and he's buried in Metz in France, and his yahrzeit is also Lag BaOmer. It's just worth mentioning.
If I may. And one thing I mentioned a few places in the Seforim that my grandfather, I mentioned he's a Holocaust survivor. The last camp that was liberated was Dachau, and when it was liberated, I believe in April, there were some survivors that had already been put on the cattle cars, and they were liberated a little bit later. And my grandfather was from the last group of survivors liberated. He was liberated on Lag BaOmer. So for me personally, for our family personally, the mercy of Lag BaOmer. If I could share with you a little mystical idea and connect it to the tragedy that happened in Meron a few years ago. This is something the Ben Ish Chai writes in his Sefer. The name of Elohim, Aleph Lamed, followed by Hey Yud Mem. The Arizal writes in many places that Elohim is Midas Hadin. The way to sweeten the din is you take the letters before. Watch this. You take the letters before Elohim. Before Aleph, it remains an Aleph. Before a Lamed, Chaf. Before a Hey, Daled. Before a Yud, Tes. Before the final Mem, a regular Mem. So Elohim becomes Aleph, Chaf, Daled, Tes, Mem. The numerical value of that is 74. The Ari says that's the secret of Bitchu Bashem Adei Ad. Ad is 74. That's what we call the Shem Habitachon. Okay, now, but the Ari writes the main switchover, the main transition is the letters Lamed He Yud, because the Aleph and the Mem don't switch. So it's the Lamed He Yud, which is 45, becomes Chaf Dalet Tes, which becomes 33. So 33 represents the core of Midas HaRachamim. And the Reb Chaim Vital says that's like the shoyresh of Lag BaOmer is the transition of the three middle letters of Elokim to Chaf Dalet Tes. But what's amazing is, if those letters don't get switched, and they remain at Lamed He Yud, that's 45. And we know that 45 is associated with the tragedy of Lag BaOmer, of those who perished on Lag BaOmer a few years ago, which is, if you understand the mystical root of Lag BaOmer, it's pretty haunting that when the Midas Hadin is not transformed into Rachamim, the Midas Hadin is the number 45.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Really. So, this is the book. That's not the book. This is the podcast, and the book has a lot of other things in it as well that we weren't able to get to. So, like I said, I will link to the book, Sefer, in the show's notes, some of your other works as well. And anyway, and like I said, in the future, perhaps we'll come back. We'll do Rabbi Meir, we'll do some other ones. And so, thank you very much, Rabbi Glatstein, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.